I've got a Escalade here with Misfire on cylinder number 3. And I am set up to do a relative compression while monitoring the intake and exhaust pulses. And let's see what that looks like. Again, crank no start. Alright, let's take a look. Okay, so here is a waveform of relative compression from this vehicle. One thing I must say, for those of you that are experienced or have a good sense of listening when cranking, this capture won't exactly 100% reflect that one that I just showed. Like with everything here, I don't always know when to pick up the camera, but this is where I'm starting, and I'll explain. This relative compression test was the first initial one that was done after realizing that we had a misfire at idle. Just like all many relative compression tests out there, pretty straightforward. Here's our ignition for cylinder 1, and then we have all cylinders producing compression -1. That is our offending cylinder. It is cylinder 3 according to the firing order, which is this here. You can see 3 is last, and then next one would be 1. That's why it's showing up the way it is. So here is cylinder 1. One before is 3. So we've confirmed low compression during cranking. We have a misfire, so we can pretty much gather that we have a mechanical problem. No need to chase coil, injector, plug, wire, any of that. And just quickly, we'll take a look at the intake and exhaust. And here clearly we can see also repetitive anomalies, as I refer to it or call it, which again are clear signs of mechanical engine internal damage. And a lot of the times you can just simply stop there. And in this business, when we are trying to deal with customers, basically you stop here and you have enough evidence and information to know that you're going to need to dive into this pretty deeply, and you can give an estimate going forward. As far as what these mean, I'll break these down, but again, you don't want to see a guy that stands out, that's repetitive. And as I said, we can elaborate on these once I continue on. Now here is a second RC test. Now this one, I must tell you, was taken a few hours after the initial one. We did the initial cranking. We knew we had damage, so we put the vehicle, we left it alone. We went on do some other stuff till we figured out what we were going to do. And this was just me late at night being curious. I wanted to tap in and do some testing, and this is the cranking one that I captured on camera. If you can tell already, there is a difference. And you can see here on the intake, repetitive, repetitive, repetitive. You can see it there, and then it starts to lessen, or it cleans up, it's less prominent. And the big obvious one is this cylinder happens to fix itself. And if you continue on at relative compression, this whole section, you would have no idea that there's a mechanical issue there. And even in the intake still, there's nothing that would point you into something mechanical. But if we continue on, towards the end, look what comes back. Number 3 starts to go down, and we start to see those blips again on the intake. So in this whole thing, in the beginning, we're pretty in bad state, very low compression. somehow magically we have compression, and then towards the end we slowly start to drop compression. This was getting confusing to me, especially after we let it sit and we just assumed we had basically kind of enough evidence to have internal damage. Okay, so now to break down what's going on with the vehicle from the beginning. This one is one that actually had timing problems. And from the timing problems, it bent a single push rod, and so that was replaced. The heads were never checked, and the vehicle was put back together. This is the state that it was running in, with a current misfire at idle. In the scan data, you can look and see that the counters were going up on cylinder number 3. So when we started looking at it, we pretty much had a good idea that we were going to have a valve problem, as far as my head was thinking. And we kind of basically already knew we were going to have a cylinder 3 issue due to the misfire counter. And obviously relative compression can tell us. That's why we decided to do that. I was already kind of expecting to find low compression on 3, which we did. And so I added the intake just to see if we were going to have an anomaly in the intake, and we clearly do. That's where I stopped, and then later when I got back to it to just do some further testing, just to see if I saw anything weird or just to learn or confirm things. That is when I saw this bad, good, bad waveform. And I kind of was taken back, and so I didn't know what to think. Most of the time when I see that, it's truly like a lifter problem, and or possibly valve spring. So now it goes to possibly still having to open up the engine, get the heads off, to maybe having a spring problem where you just pull a valve cover. So naturally, because of seeing this weird waveform, I had to continue diving in, especially to fulfill my curiosity and to also not do more work than what I have to if I don't have to. Okay, so I've pulled up the intake waveform. Clearly we can see again that anomaly. And on the intake waveform, you want to see all pulls for all cylinders. So basically that's a pull, 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 pull. And then something happens in this area, and then we have a pull here. So we can tell that we have a pull starting, and then we have a change of direction where we go up, and then we have a pull. So this here is an indication of positive pressure being introduced into the cylinder. Now you can also have a rise in pressure from a time factor, basically a delayed opening from, let's say, a bad lifter or a wore out cam can cause a rise, what looks to be a rise in pressure, which physically is a rise in pressure, but it just rises because of a delay of an intake pull. So you have to be careful when you see this to not automatically assume pressure is rising due to it being introduced into the manifold. In our case, it is due to positive pressure being introduced in here. And I've got a couple other examples videos that I explain or show this, so I'll try to I guess link them up, because it's a difficult situation when you try to differentiate the whole breakdown. And this is even if I'm interested to be as detailed as to find out exactly what the pattern is telling you. And so one of the things that you can use to tell is this portion here where a pull started, and what I like to call it, like basically it gets cut off and then starts going up. That is basically two quick changes of direction and pressure from vacuum being increased to all of a sudden cuts off and quickly turns into positive. That to me, is a sign of actual positive pressure being shot into the intake manifold. The others where it's delayed and then it'll rise, you won't have that cutoff. It'll still have a continuous, and then the rise will happen within its own column, not in the neighboring column like it is here. So this is affecting the pull and cuts it off for the neighboring column cylinder, and then it quickly shoots it up. As far as verifying which one that is, we use the firing order, and we are synced on cylinder 1 as far as the ignition sync, but that's for compression. To find cylinder 1 intake pull, you come here to your 360 mark, and to the right of that, in this column, that pull is for cylinder 1. The next one's going to be 8 and 7. Here's 2. So 8 and 7 are the ones that are being affected as far as in the intake pulls. But then you ask, we have a problem with cylinder 3. So if we go back this way, these are compression peaks, these rulers here. So let's go in firing order. 1, 8, 7, 2, 6, 5, 4, 3. Back to 1. This here is cylinder 3. Piston is going up. This is top dead center, and then goes down. So previously to hitting top dead center peak point of the piston is where it is affecting the other cylinders, because it's raising the pressure in the cylinder before it hits the top of the stroke, and that's the whole time that air is being introduced into the manifold, which that's why there's that cutoff and that rise that we clearly can see. One more way to visually help, because sometimes being that these columns are so small, it can throw things off. Let's go with cylinder 3. So we'll move this over. We'll move this over. So we're assuming that's top dead center for 3. We'll cut down the rulers to 4. So now we are basically looking at our 4 strokes for cylinder number 3, and this last one is where it starts to change direction from 540 to go up to top dead center as far as the piston, and that's why that's the area that's being affected. There's that cutoff and there's that rise, all within that column of upward travel for the piston for number 3. And so because during the upward travel in compression stroke, we've got an intake valve sealing problem, which is causing our low compression and our rise in pressure in the manifold. So what the problem here is, we've got a leaking intake valve in cylinder number 3, causing our mechanical misfire and anomalies in the waveforms. And so because I had seen that weird relative compression, this is where I decided to go further to try to verify and see what was going on. So I did another crank and nose start, but I added in cylinders to numbers 1 and 3, as you can see there. Purple is cylinder 1, a gray, which it's going to be maybe hard to see on camera, but gray is cylinder 3. And so I still have the others, and I just added the 2 in cylinders. Obviously, number 1 is our known good. And let's go ahead. Right off the bat, you can see that cylinder 3 is lower than the purple. And also that it changes in, it's not consistent, let's say. It doesn't hold the high pressure all the time. Here it's at these peaks, then it goes down, a little bit up or the same, and down, up. So cylinder 3 is varying its compression peaks as far as pressure numbers, as opposed to the known good that holds it. It's maxed out in the scaling here, but I know number 1 is good. And so that is one of the first things to look at, and it's another clue. But if you look towards the bottom, anytime you see that large dip in the expansion is a clear, sure sign of leakage. So this here, compared to cylinder 1, it's very minute, let's call it, compared to the obvious large one here. At that point there, in the in-cylinder trace, that's when the exhaust valve opens for both cylinders. But because we bled off compression and we have a leak, and you can also tell that the tower looks a little bit, that it's what they call leaning tower, which another sign of leakage. And then the sure sign is when you go into deep, deep vacuum because you bled off volume. And so now you're pulling deeper into vacuum in that void of space of the cylinder that you've basically lost. And so that's repetitive, clear sign of a cylinder leakage. Again, that is going to be due to a leaking valve where compression is high, low, stuff like that. That's another great sign of a valve sealing issue during cranking. And quickly, just another shot of the peaks. And I'll drop the purple just so you could see the pattern, inconsistent pattern of cylinder 3. It starts here, comes down, goes up, and then comes down, kind of up, down, up. So very inconsistent in trying to build pressure. It's obviously bleeding it off, holding some, bleeding off, holding some, and so on. Next, after that, and again, all this I'm trying to determine if it's the valve sealing problem is going to be a lifter, a valve itself, or possibly a spring, valve spring. So now I'm doing in cylinder for both 1 and 3 again, but now we are idling and running. So I'll get you a shot of that. And again, it's probably hard to tell, but the gray is here in the background, which clearly is lower than cylinder 1. This is at idle. There's the gray back there. And so if we look at this, zoomed in the bottom portion, when running, there's not much different in the whole section down here. Not even the where you were seeing a deep lower limit on the expansion portion. That has now lessened itself because we have basically increased RPM from cranking. So it's less time to bleed off more, but we're still bleeding off. And it has almost made it a little bit consistent now, but it's at a lower limit because we are still losing pressure through the intake valve, which clearly gives us our different levels from the known good. So it would be hard to tell or find anything here while running. The only thing you can gather from this, from an intake valve sealing problem, is that we build lower compression and there's slightly leaning tower there compared to the known good. But again, it's a little bit hard at idle, and you would almost have to, you would definitely have to do a comparison with a known good, because if you only looked at that and say stay consistent but it's low, it'd be very hard to know without doing all those previous tests that you have a leaking intake valve. And one of the things, again, to try to see if we have a lifter problem or valve spring problem is at idle, off idle, I snap the throttle and it's able to build compression, but the more, which we're going to move more air, and at even higher RPM, we're going to have even less time to bleed off compression. So that's why it can still build compression off idle closer to what a known good level should be. And so we know we can do that, but in portion area that you want to look at is what you would refer to as, let's say, the recovery after a snap. This is where your valve train is going to be loaded as well. And if there's any, say, valve spring no control or lifter no control, you would see a big difference from a known good in this recovery section here. And we actually don't have much of a difference, to the point where levels are pretty close during that recovery and nothing really stands out. So that right there tells me our control for the valve, which is basically your spring, your lifter, rocker, obviously push rod in this situation, all of that is intact and doing its job in that recovery portion where it gets stressed. And so after analyzing all those waveforms of the test and the captures that I gathered and did, I was fully 100% confident that the head had to come off and that we truly were going to have a 100% valve sealing issue that hopefully is something that we could take care of in-house and nothing too crazy. So I just wanted to break down some of those waveforms to try to help explain how to differentiate from analyzing the intake waveform when you know you have low compression from an RC test, and how to be able to know that the pressure rise is from a true rise in pressure from being introduced through a leaking valve, and how to find which cylinder is at fault, and then re-verifying all that with the further in-cylinder test of cranking as opposed to running. I believe the cranking gives you a little bit more detailed information. And then again, like I said, in the running, you almost have to have a side-by-side to compare it to, so that you don't get lost in assuming that the cylinder is fine but just running at a lower pressure if you never know to compare it to a known good. So with all that just confirmed, the next steps was to move on and pull the cylinder head and see what we find. So we've taken the head off, obviously, to inspect the valve in the crude way we usually do a leak test. What usually works out is we fill it with alcohol, let it sit for a little bit, and if it leaks, you'll see a trail, which you're starting to see the green coming down there. There you go. So that's a good way to basically leak test and see if you have valve sealing issues, which it's hard to the naked eye, but that will definitely, if it can't hold the liquid, it's not going to hold compression, and it'll give you misfires. Okay, so we wire wheeled the seat. Make sure the face is good, clear of debris, Now we are going to lap the new valve that we got, and it should all seal up. There's a brand new valve, OEM, and the reason why we need one. There you go. Hopefully you can tell. Okay, so as you can tell, the car is up and running. No issues. Mechanical condition has been restored. No more misfires. All the scope captures that we took from the beginning to end and analyzing led us to the exact problem, which was a bent valve from a previous faulted situation, and this was just something that was missed. But because of that, the testing led us to not do more work that we didn't need to do, and just basically pinpointed us 100% to that. So hopefully you gathered some from all the waveforms, the explanations, what to look for, and how to do some of the tests. Keep in mind, this vehicle is very, very known to have bad lifters, so on and so forth, and someone can just shotgun and say, oh, it's going to need lifters or this, that. But no, this one, remember, it was running, it was idling, and it had no lifter tick noise. So it's just a clear misfire, which at that time, if you don't test for relative compression, you can waste a lot of time and money throwing parts at it. Again, like I said, plugs, coil, injector, wires, whatever else, so on and so forth. And so since there is no tick noise or nothing, you have to do some of this testing to try to verify, see where the mechanical problem is and why. So that's pretty much it for this one. Again, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you on the next one.